Hi, my name is Martha Carr, and thank you for joining us as we review the Sabbath School lesson. Today, we will be reviewing lesson number 5. It is titled, Jesus, the Giver of Rest. Jesus, the Giver of Rest. Let's begin with our memory verse. It's found in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. The original translation of this verse came from Greek, from a Greek word, Sabbaton. And the Sabbath rest translation that some of the Bibles use is the more precise one, because it is a reference to the Sabbath. Also, I want to point out that in chapter 4 and 5, the Bible points out that this rest that we are talking about today, it belongs to God. Our lesson today is about rest. And this topic, we find it in chapter 3 and 4 of the book of Hebrews that we have been studying. This is a special kind of rest. It's a rest that has been offered to us, but it's not completely achieved yet. Some people have already enjoyed it, but most have not. This is the same rest that was given to Adam and Eve at creation. After God finished his creation, the creation of this world, he rested, the Bible says. And he shared with Adam and Eve the blessing of his rest. He gave the creation of this world as a gift to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were barely a day old on the seventh day, on the Sabbath, when God rested. And the very first thing that he showed them what to do is how to rest on his works. It's interesting. Well, one day we will also enjoy that rest that is still to come, like it says in our memory verse, when we will be able to enter that city which has a foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Let's go to Sunday's lesson. And Sunday's lesson is titled, The Land as a Place of Rest. The context here is the promise of God to Abraham that he would give all his descendants the land that he had promised Abraham, the promised land. So if we start from the time the children of Israel, Abraham's descendant, were liberated from Egypt, and they were in their way to the promised land, at this point, what was God's desire for them? Let's read Exodus chapter 33, verse 14. It says, as he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. So God here is saying he will be with them at all times and he would give them rest. So God's desire for the Israelites after their liberation, first, he made it known when through Moses, he told the Pharaoh, no, he wanted his children to worship freely, because Pharaoh had told Moses, oh, they can go to the desert and worship anytime their God, but then they have to come back and continue being slaves. No, God wanted them to worship him freely. And he also wanted to fulfill his promise to Abraham, where he was to give as an inheritance to his descendants the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised Abraham. And what was the benefit to the Israelites? Well, they would be living free and be able to possess their own land, because they had been living in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. So that was a great incentive to the children of Israel to go out and settle in the promised land. But one of the main things that God wanted to do with the Israelites is to have a relationship, an intimate relationship with his children, his chosen people. And that in doing that, their character will be transformed, where they would reflect God's character to the world. So let's see what rest was offered to the Israelites. Let's read Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 10. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. So God had offered them two things. He offered them the land where they could rest, a physical place, but also he offered them a moment in time to rest. The land that God had promised Moses extended from the river in Egypt all the way to the river Euphrates. And this land, Canaan, was supposed to be like a second Eden, where God and Israel together would live together. And like I was saying, this concept of this relationship with God was from the very beginning, since that Sabbath day where Adam and Eve spent watching, enjoying God's creation. They also spent the day with God in a relationship. And that's what God wanted to happen with the children of Israel too. And he asked them two things before they enter the promised land. And that was for them to eradicate all idolatry and evil that was in the land. It was also like a restoration to the land. And once God had secured the safety and that all his children were in their possession of their land, in their home, then God said that he would let them know where and in what tribe they could build him his temple, where he could live among them. And the second thing that God promised them, besides the physical rest in the land, was that moment in time. And that was the Sabbath day that he gave them through the commandments, the fourth commandment. He said, remember the Sabbath day. And with the Sabbath day, he wanted them to remember creation and remember redemption, and enjoying at the same time that rest with God, that fellowship with God every seventh day. So the Sabbath commandment, we find it in Exodus 20 and again in Deuteronomy 5, when Moses repeated it to the Israelites before entering the promised land. And so besides being a memorial for creation and a memorial for redemption, it also gave them a foretaste for the future rest. And it is interesting that both creation and redemption are exclusive works of God, because nobody can create themselves and nobody can save themselves. So when we rest on the Sabbath, we acknowledge our total dependency on God. And that's why the promise of a spiritual rest in this life and in the future is something that only God can give us through his grace. You can try to find rest through your own personal achievements or through pleasures of the world, but none of that really works or is permanent. The more worldly possessions that you achieve, the more you're going to want. And the more worldly pleasures that you seek, the more of that feeling of emptiness that is going to be left behind. Now let's go to Monday's lesson. Monday's lesson is titled, Due to Unbelief. So why didn't the Israelites enter into this rest? Let's read Hebrews 3:19. It says, so we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. This generation, the first generation, the one that was liberated from Egypt, they saw the most wonderful works from God, like no other generation has ever seen. Since the time that God started pouring the plagues in Egypt to the parting of the Red Sea, where they crossed on dry land, and then afterwards the powerful armies of Egypt were destroyed. They were provided food from heaven, the manna. They always had water from the rock. And God was always with them in the pillar of fire during the night that provided them with heat. And they had the cloud that covered them from the scorching heat of the desert. Now we know the story, and it didn't take long for the children of Israel to arrive at the border of Canaan. It was the place in Kadesh Barnea. And from there, they sent 12 spies to survey the land. The objective was for them to bring a positive report that would help them, give them motivation. But the opposite occurred. The spies brought a report. They had no faith. The spies told the people that there were giants and the cities were all fortified, and they had this powerful armies, and that there was no way that they could overthrow all those nations. But the people did not listen to the report that Caleb and Joshua brought them, where they were telling them, no, but God is in front of us and he'll fight the battles. We need to trust them. We need to trust God. But no, they chose to listen to the 10 spies. They had no faith, and This quickly spread among the congregation of Israel. Now, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this experience of the children of God through the desert? Well, we saw that unbelief is contagious. We saw how the whole congregation believed the 10 spies, because each word without faith causes discouragement and will have a negative effect on others. But when you give a testimony of faith, it motivates others. So we need to learn to develop the ability to propagate faith, not disbelief, and be able to encourage each other. Let's go on to Tuesday's lesson. Tuesday's lesson is titled, Today, When You Hear His Voice. When do we enter this rest? Let's read Hebrews 4:7. This is the last part. Again, he designated a certain day, today. This is one of the most known and famous verses found in Hebrew. It is a quote from one of David's Psalms. So again, here the context is the failure of the children of Israel to trust in God in order to enter the promised land. So this promise of rest to Israel and all mankind did not happen when the children of Israel enter the promised land. The physical part happened, but not the spiritual part, which was having that enter into that relationship with God, living with God, God abiding among them. After several centuries later on, when God gave David victory in all the battles against all the nations around him, and he made a covenant with David where he said that he was going to free him from his enemies. At that time was that God allowed David through Solomon to build him the temple. And so there was a partial fulfillment. God finally had fulfilled the settlement of the Israelites into their land with freedom, and he had fulfilled Abraham's promise. But that didn't last that long because of the idolatry that the children of Israel kept going back into. So what is the rest, this rest that we are talking about? The rest, it is all about us having a personal relationship with God. And it has been at our disposal. It has been there for everyone to have since the beginning of creation. And it's there even today. And like it says in Hebrews, some people have already entered it, and others still need to enter. So today we are called to acknowledge that God has been faithful to us and that we have enough reasons to accept his invitation right away. So again, why is today so important? Such an important moment in each of our lives. Remember, God keeps calling us. Come to me. We find that in Matthew 11:28. It is time to make a decision. So why does it require diligence to enter into God's rest? Well, the Bible makes it makes us understand that it's an urgency, because it is repeated throughout the Bible, this word expression today. And the lesson gave us several examples. And today is a time of making a decision, a time of opportunity, as well as it can be dangerous. 2 Corinthians 6:2, it says, today is the day of your salvation. So if you have an important decision to make for God, do it today. What are you waiting for? So what help is available to each of us, even if we are struggling to make the commitment we know we ought to make? Hebrews 4:16 says, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in times of need. Jesus has made that possible for us to come in prayer all the way through the throne of God, because he presented the perfect sacrifice to pay our penalty of death. He paid it for us. So now he is our high priest, and through him, he makes it possible for us to come directly to the throne of God. Now, how can we be certain the Lord will welcome us into his rest, even though we have frailties and imperfections? Again, we have studied about how Jesus became our brother. He became our high priest. So he, as our brother, he can identify with us in our frailties and our problems and worries. And as our high priest, like we said, he takes us right to the throne of God, and he facilitates that relationship between us and God. Matthew 11:28. I really love this verse where it says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now let's go into Wednesday's lesson. It is titled, Entering into His Rest. So which is God's rest? Let's read Hebrews 4:10. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. So we are encouraged to enter into God's rest, not our rest. I wanted to share with you this story because all of us who have had children and they have been in their teenage years, usually they want to go out and spend time with their friends at nighttime. And as parents, we cannot go to rest. We cannot go to sleep until all of them are back home and tucked in bed and all safe. And the same thing we see in God. There are two moments in the Bible. The first one was the Sabbath at creation, where God rested after he finished creation and after he presented to Adam and Eve with a perfect provision, the whole creation for them. He made their Garden of Eden. And the second one is when God finally allowed David, through Solomon, to build him the temple. But in the first case, it didn't last that long because of sin entering into the world through Adam and Eve. And the second one only was fulfilled partially because the children of Israel did not enter into the spiritual rest that God was offering beside the physical rest, which was entering into a relationship with God. So the first one was broken by sin, and the second one was incomplete because of sin too. God still longs to give us full and perfect rest, like Adam and Eve were given at creation, on that first Sabbath of creation. And he will give it to us once his throne has been established in the New Jerusalem. Will you want to be there? Now let's move on to Thursday's lesson. And the title of Thursday's lesson is Foretaste of a New Creation. So when will we enjoy this rest? Let's read Hebrews 4:10. It says, "For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his." So what do we rest from when we enter into God's rest? We have seen how the Sabbath is a memorial for creation and also a memorial for redemption. And it also points us to a future experience. God's rest can be enjoyed today, but it will be fully enjoyed in the future. It has to do with the restoration of all things when God creates the new heaven and the new earth, a perfect world, just like at creation. When we take this into consideration, we have a better understanding and a less legalistic view of the Sabbath commandment. For many Christians, the Sabbath has become a burden that an obligation that they have to fulfill. And this focus leads us to the famous list of we can't do this or we can't do that on the Sabbath. But we are liberated from our works when we accept God as our creator and redeemer. Like the commandment about the Sabbath says, it encourages us to enter into a celebration with God. That we are free from trying to achieve salvation by our own works. When we find salvation that is offered, when we find this salvation, it offers us a rest for our souls. On the other hand, there still remains a rest for the people of God, like our memory verse says in Hebrews 4:9. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. This is a future rest that is completely free of sin. So let us therefore be diligent and enter into this rest. Thank you for being with us, and I hope this review was helpful and a blessing for all of you.